Hi, everyone. Welcome to join today's Insightful Minds in International Macro IMIM online seminar series. We're hoping everybody is having a good summertime. So today we are very excited to have Tomás Caravello from MIT to present his very interesting paper, Evaluating Policy Counterfactuals, a VR Plus Approach. Tomás is a third-year PhD student in economics at MIT. His research interests include macroeconomics, monetary economics, time series econometrics, and anti-pricing. We are also very pleased to introduce our two discussants today, Dr. Claudiana Istrafi, economist from the Bank of France, and Dr. Song-Ki Hong, assistant professor of economics from Purdue University. Our seminar runs for 60 minutes, including Q&A from both our discussants and our audience. After that, each discussant will provide a 5-minute discussion for the paper. All right, Tomás, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you so much, Wei, for the presentation. Thank you also to the discussants. I will be presenting today my paper with Alistair McKay and Christian Walls, Evaluating Policy Counterfactuals, a VR Plus Approach. Alistair works at the Fed, so the usual disclaimer applies. The question we are interested in answering in this type of papers is a question about the counterfactual evolution of the economy under different policy, different assumptions about the conduct of monetary policy. Think, for example, about what would inflation and output volatility would have looked like if the Fed had followed a different Taylor rule, maybe with a more aggressive response to inflation. Think also about, for example, what would be the exact realized path of those two variables if the Fed had also followed a different rule. Okay, so that's the question we're after. Okay. So we're gonna see today, that the answer to a question in a large class of macro models, okay, is pinned down by two sufficient statistics. Okay. First, we will need to know the autocovariance function of the macro variables. That means we will need to know their correlations of, like between the variables and also over time, like the autocorrelation of inflation, of output, and also the cross correlations. That's the set of statistic number A, okay? And then we have B, the IRF to policy shocks. And the key word here, the key grammatical structure here is the plural. So we will need to have the IRF not only for, say, a transitory hike in interest rate, but also to hikes in interest rates, think about it as at each point of the yield curve. Okay, so you will need to know what monetary policy interventions do, but not only transitory hikes, but also more like persistent ones. Okay, we're going to show that if you had knowledge, if you had access to those two sufficient statistics, you will get the correct counterfactual. Any model that agrees on those two will give you the same counterfactual. I'm going to we're going to spend some time today showing that if you have A under the assumption of invertibility, so if you have the autocovariance function and you assume invertibility, you don't need to identify what shocks generated the fluctuations you observe. Okay, so you don't need to know if output is an inflation high because of a demand shock or a supply shock that was responded by the Fed in some way. You don't need to take a stance on that. You can just measure the co-movement patterns in the data, and that will be enough. Okay. Then we're going to implement that via what we call the VAR plus methodology that will have two parts, the VAR and the plus. Okay. So the first thing is that with VARs, we're going to show that we can estimate. It's a convenient way to estimate the autocovariance function of macro variables. Okay. It's not the only one, but it's just a simple, natural way to do it. And we will also recover via empirical estimation of impulse responses some parts of these policy shocks. Maybe you think we have good evidence of what a transitory increase in interest rate does. So we're going to estimate that. But we probably won't have evidence for what the hike in interest rate does at each point in the yield curve. Okay, so we can partially get these IRF to policy shocks, but not fully. Okay, we're going to show that for some applications, these empirically estimable objects are sometimes sufficient to get the counterfactual you want. Okay, so sometimes you can get away with only the empirical estimable objects. Okay, now if this is the case, I'm going to show in our applications in a few applications we have that's going to be a case. Then the counterfactual you get is actually holds semi-structurally, meaning basically all models that you can write down that will agree on what you observe in the data will yield the same counterfactual. Okay, and that's good. Why? Well, because it's basically robust to details about what model you think is generating the data. Okay, because basically you're just basing it on empirically estimable objects. Therefore, whatever model you write down that fits those empirically estimable objects will give you the counterfactual. Okay. So if this is the case, you basically don't need any model structure at all. Okay. Now, sometimes it's going to be a case that you cannot get away with only the empirically estimable objects. Sometimes you need some more. Okay. And for that, in our paper, there comes a plus part. So the plus part is going to take different models. Okay. But crucially, this is going to be just partial model structure. We're going to match those models to the empirically estimated IRF, okay? And then those models will extrapolate to give us the rest of the IRF to policy shocks, okay? So we are basically going to match models to the empirical evidence and then get what we don't get from the empirical evidence directly, we will get to these models, okay? Now, for some applications, we will show that actually you need that, okay? And we're also going to explore a little bit which are the key features of the models that will give you a different extrapolation. Okay? I'm going to expand that later on with the application. I think it's easier to see there. Okay. One thing I want to highlight, though, is that even if you rely on the model structure, so even if you are in the case in which you need the extra IRS that come from the model, you are still imposing less structure than a typical approach to this, which would be to write down and estimate a full DSG. Why? Well, think about Smith and Bowers, for example. If you want to take that model, estimate it, and then do counterfactuals by changing the Taylor rule for a different rule. Okay? In order to estimate that model, you need to take a stance on what are the shocks that are driving the economy, right? You have to say, well, I'm going to write down an equation for an Euler equation and maybe put a shock there. I'm going to have a shock to DFP. I'm going to have a shock to investment. I'm going to have a markup shock that drives inflation. You have to take a stance on that. Okay. This has been criticized because we don't know if these shocks are truly structural, just reflecting model specification. Okay, and that will also affect inference. Okay. In our paper, we show that actually for these questions, you don't need to take a stance on what are the shocks that generate the data. Okay, and the only role of model structure is completing or expanding our knowledge on how monetary policy transmits. So that's the only part in which the models are relevant. Okay, so you still need some more structure, maybe, but much less, I would say, than a more standard approach. Okay.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
So I'm just thinking about if there is only one DGP underlying the economy, then whether the VAR part and then the structural part, is it possible that these two parts have conflicts? They are not consistent with each other. Only one of them represents the true DGP of the economy.
The idea here is that I assume that the model in the plus part correctly reflects the transmission of monetary policy shocks or monetary policy shocks more generally. And then we are assuming that there is maybe a richer model that also explains the transmission of other shocks. But we do need to assume that we only need to model the monetary part. There might be a richer model that for reasons that are not relevant for the monetary part affect the transmission of oil shocks, of markup shocks. That could be a case. Okay? But we don't need to take a stance on what's the rest of the model that generates the other part.
Right. So basically you're saying, okay, you're assuming that the part you use to generate those impulse response and auto-covariance are correct, right? They have
yes, but the key thing is that for the answer to be correct, I only need the model to give me the correct policy IRS. Okay? If my model of the monetary transmission is not a good model for, say, the transmission of an oil shock, that will not be a problem for me. As long as I get the thetas, the policy IRS right, then I get the right answer.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so first I'm going to go through the identification result in a static model because I think it's easier to see there, and also the logic extends to the dynamic model, which is the one in which we are ultimately interested in. Okay. So we're going to assume that the DGP of this economy, this static economy, is generated by, or has this SVMA representation. Basically, YT are the macro variables of interest, and those variables are driven by some structural shocks epsilon t. And there is this theta, which you can interpret as the impulse response of the macro variables to each of the structural shocks of interest. Okay, and this is written in a linearized form. Okay, and we will not depart from linearity during the talk. Okay, we can partition this theta matrix in two parts. Okay, one part that corresponds to the non-policy shocks, and one part that corresponds to the policy shocks. So throughout the talk, the key one is gonna be the one with the policy shocks, and I'm gonna denote that generally by theta v. Okay. Just to fix ideas, a simple example that fits into this description would be a standard New Keynesian model with completely IID shocks and policy interventions. Okay. In that model, since it's IID, the expectations are always zero, so they don't matter. So the solution boils down to something static like this. Okay. And here, for example, you can think that you have something that looks like a demand shock in epsilon 1t, that's a shock to the IS curve, something that looks more like a cost push as a supply shock in the epsilon 2 in the Phillips curve, okay? And then you have some policy rule that has also some shock. Okay, so this is quite standard, okay? And you can think that these thetas are just the solution to these three equations. Okay, you have your model, you have some shocks, you know that everything is linear. In the solution of the model is going to look like this. You have to find a linear function that maps the shocks to the outcomes. That's theta, and the shocks epsilon 1, E1, E2, and V are the epsilons. Okay. What is the key restriction we are imposing for this to work? The key restriction is what we call instrument sufficiency. What this means is that the only way in which policy affects the private sector is through the realized values of the interest rate. Okay. In this case, for example, if I look at equations 2a and 2b, which represent the private sector equations, the only way in which policy enters is via the IT. Okay. Crucially, the structural parameters, the elasticity sigma and the slope of the Phillips curve kappa, are assumed to be policy invariant. Okay, so equations 2a and 2b are structured in the Lucas sense, if you want. Like if you change policy, those two equations still hold. Okay. Put it differently, the only thing that matters to the private sector is what the interest rate does, and it doesn't matter if that's because some rule that generated that systematic movements or because of some shock. Okay. Now, more generally, okay,
Tomás, just one
yes,
question.
Yes.
So there is maybe then this links with inflation expectations, the interest rate. So monetary policy cannot affect otherwise inflation expectations.
I mean, in this very simple setup, I'm kind of shutting down the expectation channel because it's static. I'm going to relax that later on to go to the full dynamic model that we have arbitrary lags and leads.
Okay.
But the key thing is that monetary policy can affect expected inflation. Okay. But basically, all that matters is for that expected inflation is the path of interest rate. It doesn't matter if it's generated by a rule or by a shock. Okay. I'm going to discuss a little bit more what this rules out. Okay.
Because when you go later to the bounded rationality and
yeah, I'm going to explain exactly what this includes and what this rules out. Yeah.
Okay.
So there are some things about the expectation formation process that we can have, and other things that we can't have. I'm going to be a little bit more specific on that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. More generally, you can write down the type of models we have in two sets of equations. Okay. Here I have number 2, which is the private sector equations. Okay. In my previous case, those will be the Phillips curve and the IS curve. You can think that it may have more equations because your model has more variables. Okay. And you will write down a policy equation, which is equation number 3 that has these A's. Okay. These A's and these H's are matrices that depend on structural coefficients. Okay. A little bit of notation. X here are going to be macro variables that you can observe. W's are going to be macro variables that you cannot observe. Okay, that's fine. You can have that. The Z's here are going to be the policy instrument. Okay, in my example from before, it's just the interest rate today. Okay. Then ETs are the non-policy shocks and VT are the policy shocks. Okay, and how do we know which is which? Well, we can see that the policy shock only enters in the policy equation, the non-policy shock only enters in the non-policy equation. Okay, so that's some notation we're gonna kind of keep throughout the talk. Okay, what restrictions are imposed in this family of models? Well, there are three restrictions. This is static, so only the values today matter, not expectations, not lags. We're gonna relax that in a few minutes. That is linear, okay, and instrument sufficiency. Those two we will not relax. Okay. Going back to Claudiana's question, what does this allow and what does this not allow? Well, you will allow some departures from rational expectations, okay, but in which the mapping between the expectations of, say, households and the true full information expectation function, okay, is some structural mapping that does not depend on what policy does. For example, if I do cognitive discounting à la Gabé, there is a parameter that dampens whatever you expect from the future by a constant rate, and that rate is not policy dependent. That you can have. Okay, so there is some structural thing in how people form expectations in which they dampen the future, and that's not policy that is policy invariant. That departure you can have. What you cannot have is something like a signal extraction problem, say like in the Lucas Island model. Why? Because in that case, in the Lucas Island model, each guy is trying to figure out if the demand is high because there is some structural shock to demand, or it's just because monetary policy generating it. And they, since they don't know, they're going to do some filtering to figure out how much of the shock they expect to be like a true shock and how much they expect to be like a policy-induced shock. But now, if policy becomes more activist or less activist, that's going to alter the filtering problem, and that's going to alter how they form expectations, and that's a problem for us. Because then it's not only the path of the interest rate that matters, but also what's really generated because it changes the expectation formation process. So that you cannot have, we rule that out, okay, for these results to go. Does that answer the question? Okay. But the type of models that say when you write down a DSG or even more like hand type models, those models usually do satisfy this instrument sufficiency. Now, if you have a Jacobian that has the path of interest rates and that's the only thing that matters, then you are in this world of instrument sufficiency. Okay, so it's not any model you can write down, but it's a very large class of models that are included here. Okay.
Can I ask one?
Yes, please.
So so here in the policy rule, there is only the policy shock. Then, let's say, okay, suppose I assume that the Fed also adjusts the monetary policy rate with the natural rate of interest. Then that the natural rate of interest shock, so any shock that drives the natural rate of interest, this shock should also should appear as both in the structural equations and the policy.
Yes, to me, in my notation, that's a W. That's like a macro variable that I do not observe.
Okay.
So in the original rule, I don't need to take a stance on what the rule is, but you do allow that rule to respond to things that the econometrician does not observe.
So the W is kind of like some macro fundamentals which are not observed.
The W, yes.
Yeah,
they're not observed by the econometrician. Yes.
X and Z's are what are observable.
Exactly.
And then the difference between X and Z is one of them is the policy instrument, right?
Yes.
The policy instrument, right?
Yes. Z is a policy instrument, and X are the rest of the macro variables.
I see. Thank you.
Okay. So given this setup, what I am interested in is what would have happened to the economy if instead of having that equation 3 with some A's that we had before, I changed that equation to a new equation with some different matrices A tildes, meaning I changed the policy. Okay, I have, say, a Taylor rule with a more aggressive inflation response. Okay. Going back to Ren's question, notice that here I don't have the W because I cannot observe it. Okay. I could put the shocks, so I could still add shocks to this equation, that's fine. Okay, but since I'm assuming that the W is not observed, I cannot condition that. Okay. Now, say that you had access to the model. Okay, we're going to show later on that you don't need to have access to the model. Okay, but if you did, okay, if you switch out our original policy equation by this new one, okay, you will get new thetas. So you will get new impulse, new propagation, okay, because now policies are acting differently. We will encode that in this theta tilde here, okay? And then once you have that theta tilde, and if you also had access to the structural shocks, then you can, I'm going to show you in a second how to build the counterfactuals of interest. Okay. Going back to the introduction, what type of questions we try to answer? Well, one question is, what would have happened, say, to inflation output volatility? Well, notice that if you have the original thetas, you can compute that, or you can see it from the data, that's fine as well. If you magically had some access to these counterfactual theta tildes, you could also construct the counterfactual second model. Okay, so if you know how shocks propagate under the new rule, and you know what the shocks are, you can basically find the counterfactual volatility for output and for inflation. Okay? If you wanted to know the exact realized path, you can also have that, because if you have the new thetas and you have the path of structural shocks, then you can just do this construction, take the structural shock and the new theta, and you get your counterfactual. Okay? That will be in a sense, the typical approach would be to fully estimate a model and then do this. Okay? We're going to show though that you don't need to do that, and there are some conditions that you don't need to do that. You need less information. Okay? So the main proposition here is going to be that under the assumption that the data generating process is invertible, okay, which means that basically the shock can be spanned by the observables, okay? Under that extra assumption, then knowledge of the time series of the macro variables, which we observe, the variance covariance matrix of these macro variables. So that's the second moment. That's the autocovariance function, but here it's static, so the only element will be like the contemporaneous variance and covariances. Okay, that's set one of things. And B, the IRF to a policy shock. Okay, in this case, there is only like one instrument, which is the interest rate today. So you need an IRF of each variable to that. If you have those two sets of things, then you can build your counterfactuals without actually knowing the model. Okay. Now, why does this work and how does this work? So let's dive into that. Okay. First, notice that if you had access to the true structural shocks, okay, I mean, that's not what we are assuming here, but just as a thought experiment. If you had access to the true structural shocks and this matrix of IRFs to policy shocks, if you have access to those two things, then you can build the counterfactuals. How? Well, what you will do first is to use the shocks and regress the observables on the shocks to get the structural thetas. Okay, so from the observed data and the shocks, I can get the thetas just by regressing one in the other. Okay. Now, once you have the true structural thetas, okay, you can apply the methodology by Alistair and Chris' previous paper, okay, and then you can use the original theta and the policy matrix, the matrix of policy shock IRFs, this theta V, to get the counterfactual IRFs theta tilde. Okay, they basically show that in again a similar family of models to this one. If you want to construct counterfactual impulse responses, it is sufficient to have the original one and then the matrix of policy shocks, basically. The impulse response to policy shocks. That gives you the correct counterfactual. Okay? The key thing here is that this works because instrument sufficiency. It doesn't matter if the path of interest rates is that way because a rule or a shock generated it. So you're going to use the shock to enforce the correct path of interest rates under the counterfactual rule. Okay? That's basically why this works. We made some progress, okay, because now we don't need to know the full model. We only need to know the structural shocks and the theta nu, the theta B. But this is not what I promised. I promised that you don't need to know actually the structural shocks. Okay. Well, this is what I just said. Once you have the two, you can construct the counterfactual. But again, this step one relies on the structural shock. Okay. But actually, you don't need to know the structural shock. You can get away with knowing the observables of the data and the variance covariance matrix of the autocorrelation function of the data. Why? Well, given that this is a time series, you can always, by the word representation theorem, you can write it this way. Okay? There are some reduced form world innovations U, and there is some matrix phi that will represent the statistic properties of the data. Okay, that's a theorem we know. Now, of course, these U do not have any structural interpretation, so we don't know what those are. Maybe they are like the residual. Think about this like a VAR residual. We know that the VAR residual in equation 1 It's not a demand shock. It's some mix of structural shocks that hit the economy. Okay. Now, in this case, for example, just for simplicity, we are using like a Cholesky, like recursive identification scheme, no? Because I mean, actually, a world representation is not unique. You can build as many as you want just by rotating stuff. Okay, we just pick one rotation. It doesn't matter which one you pick. Okay? For simplicity, we do Cholesky, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Now, one thing you could do is to say, well, these are some shocks. I can rotate them, and I will get some result. Okay, I can apply Mackay and Wolf to each of the wall shocks, and that will give me some result. You can always do that. Fine. It turns out that doing that actually gives you the correct counterfactual. Okay. Why? Okay, because yeah, it was clear that if you for each structural shock change its propagation, you get the correct theta, everything works fine. But here it's not clear why rotating this U that doesn't have a structural interpretation actually gives you the right thing. Okay. Well, it turns out that the key assumption here is invertibility. Why? Well, because we know that under invertibility, the reduced form world innovations U are some rotation of the true structural shock. Okay? There are some linear combination of the true structural shock. Okay? We don't know what that rotation is. Okay? This is a typical problem of the old school, like VAR literature putting zeros in the matrix. Okay, we don't know what P is. The literature, for example, argues some identification restrictions. Okay, but we do know that that P is an orthogonal matrix, meaning that P transpose times P equals the identity matrix. Okay, so we don't know what it is, but we know it exists. And with that knowledge, we know that if we did this Mackay and Wolf thing for each wall shock, what we will get, this phi tilde, can be expressed as theta tilde, the true counterfactual theta, rotated times P prime. Okay, and again, we don't know what P prime is. Okay, so we know that we are getting some rotation, that is a mix of the thing we want and this P that we don't know. That's all we know for now. Okay. Now, knowing that, notice that then if I do this construction, okay, so if I take the phi tilde times the reduced form world innovation, well, the phi tilde equals theta tilde times P prime. This is this first term here. The U equals P times the true structural shock. But then since P is an orthogonal function, an orthogonal matrix, P prime times P is the identity, so that cancels, and you end up getting the correct counterfactual. Okay? Why does this work then? Because under invertibility, the reduced form world innovations are just a linear combination, a one-to-one mapping of the true structural shocks. And it turns out that rotating the true structural shocks, or rotating via Mackay and Wolf, the wall shocks that are a linear combination of those is equivalent. Okay? So that's the reason why you get the correct counterfactual out of this. Okay?
So can I ask a question here?
Yes, please. Yes.
So I actually have two questions here. So first of all, so everything crucially depends on this invertibility assumption. So I want to know first how things are going to be screwed up if the invertibility fails.
We're going to go there in a few slides.
Very good, thank you. And then the second related question is how, as a practitioner of using this method, what would you suggest to, for example, test whether the invertibility assumption is innocuous or something very bad?
I'm gonna talk actually like 5-10 minutes about that, but just let me give you a quick preview. The key role of invertibility here is ensuring that forecasts based on observables are as good as forecasts based on the true shocks. Or put it differently, that those forecasts are like full information forecasts. Okay? If invertibility fails, then it's not true anymore that forecasts based on observables are equal to full information forecasts. So then the question becomes, if invertibility doesn't hold, how far I am with my forecast to the true full information forecast that I would need. Okay? I'm going to show in a few slides that if you take, say, this Metz-Bowers model, that is a model that matches the second moment properties of the data, the answer is that when invertibility fails, you are actually not that far from full information forecast. So the answer you get is actually close to the correct counterfactual. So that's number one. And then number two, what you want to ensure is that there are no variables that you can add to your VAR that materially improve the forecasts. Or put it differently, that Granger cause the variables of interest. Okay, I'm going to go into that in some more detail, but it's a great question because that's a key assumption I'm doing here. Any other questions?
I mean, so here, how so for a small VAR and a large VAR be different? So whether you include additional, so because your step 2 basically says observing YT is very important, because that give you the autocovariance matrix, and then it doesn't matter for the true shocks because you can do that rotation. Then the question is, okay, suppose I've introduced additional observable in the model, how that matters for the counterfactual analysis?
So if I add additional observables in the VAR, what's going to happen is that the wall shocks may change, okay?
Right.
But if these additional observables do not materially change the forecast of the variables of interest, then the answer I'm going to get from this procedure is going to be very similar. Okay, so adding more observables matters as much as those observables help to forecast the variables of interest.
Right. Okay.
You can think, for example, assume that say you have I don't know, output gap, inflation, interest rate, and those two are driven only by 3 shocks. Assume that, and then you have other variables, unemployment, investment, consumption, that they are driven by a different set of shocks. Like crazy, of course, that doesn't hold, but assume that that's the case. Then, if you add more variables to the VAR, you will be correctly spanning other shocks that are completely irrelevant for the outcomes of interest in this like random model I'm discussing. So if you did that, although adding more observables will maybe you help forecast the other variables, since it doesn't help to forecast inflation, output, and interest rates, then the answer will be going to be the same. I'm going to dive deeper into this in a few slides. Okay,
thank you.
Yeah. Okay. How does this generalize to the dynamic model? It's going to be kind of straightforward. It's basically the same, but instead of having one theta, you have a sequence of thetas that capture the dynamics, basically. Okay. Now the environment is not a static SVME, it's a full like SVME infinity. So now not only contemporaneous shocks matter, but also lags of the shocks matter. Okay. So that's why you have these lags here. Now the thetas come from the solution to an impulse response system. So it has a very similar mathematical expression as before, but now W's, X's, and Z's are no longer variables, but rather the full sequence of the variable. Okay. So in order to be very clear, now the instrument Z is not only the interest rate today, but actually the full path of the interest rate. Okay. And consequently, this V0, okay, is now not only a monetary policy shock that raises the interest rate today, but it's actually a menu of new shocks, okay, where each element of that vector is basically telling, for example, the first element, what happens to the economy if I raise interest rates today. The second element is going to be, what happens if today I announce an increase of the interest rate tomorrow? The third element, what happens if today I announce an increase 2 periods from now, and so on and so forth. Okay? Because now, if you think about it, the policy instrument is the interest rate, but it's the full path. Having a different path will have a different implication for the economy. Okay. Again, so we have lifted the static restriction, but we keep linearity and instrument sufficiency. Again, notice that the only way in which the policy enters in the private sector is the path of Z. Like the matrix is the H's basically do not depend on the A's. Okay. Just notation, we're going to denote for a variable we are going to build this object is theta nu. Okay. Which is, it should be like theta V. Let's call it theta V, okay? Which is a matrix that contains, each column of the matrix is the impulse response of that variable to a different news. Okay? So now we only have the impulse response to it. Before we had the impulse response to a hiking interest rate today. Now we need to know what happens to, say, output if we hike interest rate today, but also what happens if we announce today that we're going to hike tomorrow, or what happens if we announce today that we're going to hike in 2 periods, and so on and so forth. Okay. Our object of interest is very similar as before. We want to know what happens if we change the rule to an alternative rule of our choosing. Notice that now the rule also is written with this boldface X and Z. So now the rule can be dynamic, it can have inertia, or it can have also forward-looking terms. For example, you react to expected output growth. Okay, that's totally fine. And the questions of interest are similar to before. Okay, you can ask, okay, what happens with the second moments, say variances, covariances of output inflation, or also with the correlation. Maybe you want to know if inflation is more or less persistent. You can answer that. Okay. Okay, these are just the formulas of how to compute that from the thetas. Okay, this is like a standard time series thing, nothing interesting here. Okay. You can also ask about the historical evolution. Okay, what would have happened to the exact path of the variables if we had a different policy rule? Okay. And in the dynamic context, there is also another counterfactual that makes sense asking here, not in the static case, which is conditional forecast. Basically, you have a baseline forecast for the economy, okay, and then you want to do some scenario analysis, if you want, of okay, what would happen to the economy if the Fed had followed a different path or a different rule for interest rates? Okay, just a quick comment here, okay. The way this is written, it's as if we had changed the rule for the infinite past, right? Because you can see that the thetas that appear here are far out in the past. In our application, what we actually do is something different, which is say that at date T, policy announces the changes and implements that moving forward, but of course not in the past, because the past is given. So if you want to do that, you have something similar, but you have some extra initial conditions term that just conceptually doesn't add much, but you can deal with that as well. The proposition in the dynamic context looks very similar to before. You still need invertibility, okay? Now invertibility in the full dynamic case means that the shock is spanned by current and lagged values of the macro variables, okay? And then under that assumption, you get something that has the same flavor as before, okay? The only things you need to know are the observables, its autocovariance function, and then the policy causal effects, crucially for interventions in each horizon, okay? Or say for hikes at each point in the yield curve, okay? The reason why this works is exactly the same as before, okay? You can take the world representation of the data, rotate each of the world innovations using Mackay and Wolf, you will get some phi tilde, okay? But it turns out that the counterfactual base on this phi tilde and the world innovations is the same as the counterfactual based on the true structural shocks, again, because it's rotation business knowing. Okay? Under the assumption of invertibility, these wall shocks are some rotation of the true structural shocks, and we don't need to know which rotation they are. Okay? It's the same reason it works as the previous proof. Okay, like adding dynamics doesn't change. Okay, going to the previous question on invertibility. Okay, that was the key assumption. Everything worked magically, that P canceled magically because of invertibility. We know from the time series literature and also from some macro literature that this may be a very strong assumption that may not hold in the data. So what happens if it doesn't hold? Okay. So in order to address this question, what we did is to take this Mesa-Vargas model, okay, which we think it's a model that kind of captures properly the second moments properties of the US data, okay? And then implement our proposition by taking the full set of observables and ensures invertibility, and then by progressively shrinking it. Okay? Meaning, if you have more shocks than observables, invertibility doesn't hold. You can never span 7 shocks with 3 observables. But you can still do our construction and see what happens. Okay? Okay. So what I'm doing here is the spectral density, okay, for these variables. Okay, the spectral density is just a useful way to summarize the autocovariance patterns of the data. Okay, under the old rule, you have some volatility in output, low volatility in inflation, and low volatility in interest rates. And then we change the rule to say a Taylor rule with a much more aggressive response to output. Okay, and as we can see, the counterfactual, which is depicted in black, lowers output volatility at the expense of higher interest rate volatility and inflation volatility. Okay? And we did that just by taking the model and changing the Taylor rule by a new rule. Okay. Now, this is what happens if you implement our proposition with the full set of observables. Okay? This model turns out it's invertible, so if you do it with the full set of observables, you get the exact same answer as changing the rule like the typical one. Okay, so that's reassuring. We didn't miss anything in the proof. At least this is not a counter example. Okay, so that's good. Okay. Now, what happens if instead of taking the full set of observables, you take a smaller information set? So what happens if, for example, you take the three outcomes of interest rate, output, inflation, and investment and consumption. And again, here invertibility doesn't hold because you have more shocks than observables, but you can still do our thing. You can run a VAR on these variables, on the true GP is different, so you're going to get some approximation to the true GP. You can compute everything as we did. Okay. Notice that the lines kind of line up very closely. So you get a counterfactual that is not exactly correct, but is very close to the truth. What happens if instead of that, I take the three macro variables plus hours, something very similar? And what happens if I take only those three macro variables? Still something very similar. Okay. Why does this happen? So why in this model, if invertibility doesn't hold, you still get a pretty good answer? Okay? Not perfect, but pretty good, pretty close to the truth. Well, the key thing is, as I previewed before, the reason why invertibility is important in the proof is because it ensures that the forecast based on lag values of the macro variables are the same as forecasts based on the shocks that in the model are equivalent to full information forecasts. Okay? The key thing invertibility is buying us is that you can build full information forecasts from the observables. Now, what happens? In the model we just used, once you drop invertibility, so once you drop some observables and build your forecast based on a smaller information set, your forecasts deteriorate, okay? But they don't deteriorate they don't deteriorate by a lot, basically. So here you can see the forecast error, okay, relative to the benchmark of full information, okay? You notice that if you use all the observables, you get full information forecast, so this line is at 1. Then if you use a small information set, you get somewhat higher forecast errors. But as you can see, they are not much higher. They're like 5 or 10% higher, okay? So in this model, at least, in order to predict interest rates, output, inflation, adding more observables does not help you much, okay? And going back again to the previous great question, what does this imply in terms of what's the applied takeaway of this? Well, you need to make sure that there are no macro observables that you can add that meaningfully help predict the variables you're interested in. Or in other words, there are no additional variables that range your cost, the macro variables of interest that you wanna study. Okay.
Here a quick suggestion is if we can add one more graph to the figure where you begin to have too little variables so that the forecast becomes very bad, then you will be able to show, right, that things get screwed up. And then also, if you can also show the test that you suggested, like grand causality test, something like that, that distinguishes between the two cases, that would be also interesting to see in this figure as well.
Yeah. Thank you for the suggestion. Here, I'm the smaller information set I can, well, it's true. Like I take the 3 ones that I'm serving because that's like the minimal if you want. But it's true that you could also try to forecast output without lag output. But you're right. That's going to be very
or coming up with some other model, other than this model, right? So that you can actually distinguish between the case where failure of the invertibility is big matter versus something that doesn't matter.
Yeah. Thank you. Was there another question, comment? Okay. How much time do I have? Okay. Now we know what elements do we need. We need the autocovariance function and we need the policy causal effect. So how do we go about estimating? So that's where this VAR plus thing comes in. It's just the implementation of how to get these sufficient statistics. Okay? We're going to recover the two key sufficient statistics in 2 steps, the VAR step and the plus step. For the VAR step, what we do is to use the reduced form VAR to estimate the autocovariance function. Okay. When I say reduced form, it's just run a VAR, do not care about the identification scheme. So just run regress the macro variables and its lags. Okay. And that's a good way to estimate the autocovariance function of the data, the variances and dynamic covariances of the data. Okay. And then we will also use a structural VAR where there we will need some identification, okay, to get some parts of the policy causal effects. In our application, we just estimate one column. So we estimate only the improved response to one shock. Okay. It turns out that it could be a case that for the counterfactual question you have, only the estimated IRF is enough, okay, to get you quite close to the true counterfactual. Okay. If that's the case, and we're going to show some cases in which that does happen, then the method gives you an answer that holds semi-structural, in the sense that any model that would agree on that empirical evidence will give you the same, but then you don't need the model because you directly have the empirical evidence, okay, from the VAR part. Okay. Then, so it could be the case that for your question, this is not sufficient, so then you need the plus part. What is it? How do we implement the plus part? Well, we consider many of models, okay, for 4 different models in our case, that we match to the empirical evidence. So we do IRF matching with this empirical estimated IRF as a target. And then that model, once we have the estimated parameters of the model, we can get the extrapolation for the rest of policy shocks that we do not observe. Okay? But crucially, this model is only modeling the monetary transmission part. So this is Cristiano moments. Okay, it's not Smith-Bautas where you model the full DGP of the economy. You only need to model the monetary transmission part. Okay, so even if you use this structure, this is still less structured than a full information DGP. Okay. I'm going to discuss some applications. I'm going to also talk about the implementation details in conjunction with the application because it makes more sense to do them together. Okay, so the 3 applications we have in the paper are one for each of the counterfactuals in the dynamic part. So we have a question about inflation and output volatility, a question about the exact path of the economy, and a question about the scenario analysis. Okay. The rule we're going to use, it's something that's called, or it can be named as a flexible inflation targeting rule. Think about this as a planner trying to minimize quadratic loss that has inflation, output, and some interest rate smoothing term. Okay. Why we use this one in particular? Well, because if you go to the team book that the staff prepares for the FOMC meetings, this is one of the rules they discuss. Okay, so they discuss Taylor rules and then some variants of this. We take the baseline they use there and use that as our interpretation of flexible inflation target. Okay. We're going to look at the average business cycle, like how inflation and output volatility will have changed if the Fed had stick to this rule. We will look at what would have happened during the Great Recession if we did not have the CLB. And we will also look at what would have happened if at the height of the COVID inflation, we have a forecast of how the economy is gonna evolve from there, how that forecast would have changed under different policy assumptions. Okay. For implementation, for the autocoherence function, we're gonna use a large-scale VAR. Okay. Basically, think about the VAR base almost identical to the one used in the Angeletos main business cycle paper. The VAR has like 10 observables, so we think that kind of has enough information to span the relevant shocks for the US economy. For the policy causal effects, we identify them using bringing like an external instrument, and we use this the Arroba Drexel shock. Okay, that gives you like basically what happens if there is a transitory increase in interest rates, that is like a shock, like generates a transitory increase in interest rates, what happens to upward inflation. Okay. And then I want to discuss in the next slide what are the models we use for the plus part. Okay, so for the plus part, we use 4 models. Okay. These 4 models are like a 2x2 combination of 2 different features. On one dimension, we consider 2 variants, rank and hang models. For the rank models, this is basically your standard medium scale DSG. Think about Cristiano moments. Okay. We only care about the monetary part, though. So the only shock that we have into that model is the monetary shock. Okay. For the hand part, we keep all the equations to be the same, but we change the household block for a heterogeneous agent blocks, as in Oclair 2020 microchunks macrohams paper. Okay, that's basically essentially that. Okay. And we put that hand block and we add like a sticky information as they do to match the hams in output. Okay. Otherwise, it's known that if you have a hand model with no extra source of sluggishness, then you cannot match against ham shaping products. So that's what the paper shows. We take what they do, put it here. Okay. So that's one margin, rank versus hand. The other margin we take is behavioral versus, if you want, non-behavioral rational expectation models. Okay. We take each of these Hank and rank models and create a standard version, which is basically what they have, what these other papers have, and then a behavioral version of these models. In the behavioral version, what we do is we take price and wage setting, but dampen the expectation formation term using cognitive discounting as in Garavello, as in this paper by Xavier Garavello. Okay. What that gives you is that now price and wage setting are less forward-looking, okay, and that in general equilibrium will change how forward-looking the full model is. And in principle, intuitively, this model is going to be less reactive to forward guidance as the rational expectations versions of the model. Okay. We find that all four of these models, so the rank, both in rational expectations and behavioral version, and the Hank, same two versions, can match the empirical target very well. So they all can match the IRF. This is almost indistinguishable. Okay. So the data does not allow us to tell apart these four models. Okay. But they extrapolate differently. In particular, the key friction that changes how extrapolation works is this behavioral cognitive discounting part. We find that within, say, rational expectations or within behavioral, rank and Hank do not generate meaningfully different extrapolation. So the relevant margin seems to be more the behavioral part. Okay. Now let's go to the application. So the first application is the average business cycle. The question here is how would inflation, output, and interest rate volatilities would have looked like if the Fed committed to this flexible inflation targeting rule all throughout the sample. Okay. So the black line here is the data, the standard deviations of the variables in the data, and the densities here are basically the posterior densities. Once you basically estimate all models, do model averaging, and then basically for that posterior of models, you compute the counterfactual for each draw. And that's what you get. That's why you have a distribution there. Okay. What we see here is that takeaway number one, the Fed could have lower output volatility meaningfully. Okay. Inflation a little bit, but not as big as in output, and the price to pay here will be like a slightly higher interest rate volatility. Okay. No, something that I'm not showing here, but we try and we do in the paper is what would have happened is if instead of using the full model implied matrix, we only use the empirical shock, okay, or the empirically matched shock instead of using the full model implied matrix. But it turns out that the picture that emerges is very similar. So that means that this takeaway that you could have lower output volatility meaningfully, okay, does not rely on any particular model structure, okay? Because if you only use the empirical match shock, you get something very similar. The intuition for this is that in the data, there seems to be some demand type shock that generates fluctuations, okay? Which is kind of the main business cycle shocks that's in the Angeletto's paper. But one way to see why these gains you could have been achieved is basically look at the original impulse response to that shock, okay? And then look at the counterfactual impulse response to that shock. So basically what the Fed is doing is leaning more heavier against this demand type shock that generates fluctuations. Okay?
Can I ask?
Yes, of course. Yes.
So when you do this counterfactual, do you require that the main business cycle shock is independent from the monetary policy?
No. Okay. So in order to do this picture, what I'm doing is identify the main business cycle shock as they do in their paper. That gives me an impulse response, and then apply McKay and Wolf to that impulse response to get the counterfactual impulse response. So that's what I'm doing here. But that's in any way that's not being used at all for the previous picture. So for this picture does not rely on it.
Right. But my question is, so for application purpose, then the third shock, so I call it the third shock because you have transitory monetary shock, persistent monetary policy shock. Those two are helping you to generate the policy counterfactual. And then the main business cycle shock seems to be a shock that the third shock. My question is whether the main business cycle shock has to be independent with the two monetary policy shocks that you use to construct a counterfactual.
So that's more like an estimation question. Okay, that's more like, okay, are you confident that you are getting the correct black line here, or it might not be? Okay.
Right. So for example, suppose the shock that driven most of the business cycle fluctuation is monetary shock.
Yeah.
Then would
That's
that
fine.
matter? Does that matter?
No, that doesn't matter. I mean, if that was the case, then we would be saying the Fed generated a ton of noise in the data. If the Fed didn't generate that noise, then we would have observed lower fluctuations. That's completely fine. We're not taking a stance on what this shock is.
Okay.
Then our second counterfactual is basically the Great Recession. Okay, this is the path for the variables of interest. What would have happened if we lifted the ZLB and allowed the Fed to respond according to this rule? Well, this would have happened. Okay, you would observe a large cut that stabilizes output meaningfully, and we have a little bit higher inflation. Okay, so this is expected, but you can answer to this question using our method. And then for the post-COVID inflation, okay, this is a benchmark forecast constructed from the VAR, okay, starting at 2021 Q2. So you see inflation is quite high, and you expect it to go back down slowly over time. You expect to have some recession, and you expect to have some increase in the Fed funds rate. Okay, and then we take this baseline scenario and ask, what would have happened if the Fed had followed, or the Fed started following this inflation targeting rule? Moving forward, how will our forecast change? Well, this is what happens if you ask that question to the rational expectations model. These models tell you that what the Fed should do is actually lower interest rates, and that will lower inflation very meaningfully and basically not generate a recession. Now, why is this? Well, if you look at it, I'm not showing it in the picture, but basically what the Fed is doing here is promising a hike of real rates in like 2030, like very far out, and because of the rational expectations of the model, that forward guidance is super powerful and lowers inflation today with not a large action and output. Okay. Whereas if you ask the same question to behavioral models, then since you cannot do this, then if you want to lower inflation, you have to hike interest rate today. So that's what the counterfactual tells us here. Okay, you have some recession, some more recession, and then inflation goes down, but more slowly, okay, because expectations don't help you as much. So finally, what happens if we average across these two sets of models? Well, our method gives us like huge uncertainty, okay, because there is a set of models that tells you that you should hike rates, and another set of models that tells you that you should lower rates, but we cannot distinguish them. So once we average them with equal weights, we get this huge confidence intervals. Okay. Just to conclude, what we do in this paper is to give a new approach to produce and evaluate policy counterfactuals. Okay, we like it because we use less model structure than standard approaches, but still we can have a wide variety of applications. Okay, we showed under what conditions these two sufficient statistics are all we need, and then we show how to build them from the data and from some model structure. Okay. There are some restrictions here, okay, because the model space, it has some restrictions on how expectations should be formed. This is also relying on linearity, and also we can do welfare analysis because that, of course, relies on the model. And for future research, what we would like to know, or what we would be interesting to see being done, is to have first a research set of policy shocks, okay, because here it's important to have shocks at each point in the yield curve, okay. Here we're using evidence only on transitory increases, but having evidence on the macro effects of increases farther out in the yield curve will be great here, because it will also help you to distinguish between behavioral and non-behavioral models. And then in the model part, basically what you want is, we show that since the key thing is these IRFs, an extra friction matters only if it affects these IRFs. And in our case, for example, we see that Hank and rank doesn't appear to be like a huge difference in this extrapolated IRS, whereas the behavioral part does. Okay, thank you all for having me. I think I'm right on time, 60 minutes. And if you have more questions, I'm happy to chat about them. I'm looking forward to hear the great discussions.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Very intriguing presentation. So before we move to the discussion, let me ask if our audience has any other questions. Okay, if not, we can move to the discussion part. We can get started from Claudiana. Can we get started?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Let me help you share your slides.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks a lot, Thomas. It was great presentation. You can go to the next slide. So, I mean, my overall comment is fantastic work, but not just fantastic work, but line of work, because this paper builds up on several of the projects of co-authors. So definitely it's great, and especially it's great also great work for policymakers. I'm at Banque de France, but I've been in several central banks, and we use a lot VARs. We use a lot these methods of doing policy counterfactuals. What would have happened if are very very precious for us. I have, since given the time and the work is already great, I have only 2 comments that I call comments on the targeted evidence. So 2 simple comments on the VARs and monetary policy shock. So if you can go further. Okay, so I just borrowed the words from the paper that the heart of the approach is the combination of direct empirical evidence with model-based policy causal effect extrapolation. And so, which means that the kind of the main ingredients that actually are needed for the models also to be judged and matched is the VAR evidence and the shock evidence, which in this case is a monetary policy shock. I think you could make this approach for different type of shocks, but here the example is with monetary policy. And so we start with VAR. So as I said, the co-authors have several papers actually comparing VARs with other local projections. And one thing that come often in their work is the biases, several biases in the VARs. So since VARs in this paper are important, because then you're going to match the impulse responses for the models, to judge the models, to judge everything. So I wonder if then maybe you could do something with the LP local projections, which appear to be more robust. And if there is this, you can do a LP plus instead of a VAR plus. I understand that there is this autocovariance statistics that you need, but I don't know if there is a way to robustify the method based on actually evidence that comes from this line of research. That was my simple comment on the VARs. The second is that another crucial element of all this like recurring these methods of counterfactuals from McKay and Wolf is that they are based on identified shocks, empirically identified shocks. So you have some empirically identified shocks, and they use them to back up the systematic part of monetary policy, at least with respect to monetary policy question. And more specifically, you're using a monetary policy shock that is from Aruba and Drexel, that uses, let's say, more informed method, like a Romer and Romer based type of identification, but with more information. So it's a cleaner type of shocks to the original Romer and Romer. However, these types of identification, they have this implicit assumption that systematic monetary policy is time invariant. And if you assume away this time invariant, then actually you also run into problems. And next slide, please. So I'm shamelessly going to advertise one of my recent works with Lucas and Matthias from Mannheim, where we show that if you go away from the implicit assumption that you have a time invariant systematic monetary policy, then we show in theoretically that the shocks that are estimated, the shocks that are estimated are contaminated by the macro shocks. They are predictable by time variation in systematic monetary policy, and they lead to biased IRF estimates. And we show this concretely with Romer and Romer type of shocks, that actually they are predictable by systematic monetary policy, which our paper is the FOMC Hawk and Dove balance. You say, what do we care? We use the Aruba Drexel. Next slide. And we just show actually that, yeah, they are pretty good compared to Romer and Romer, so they suffer less, but still they are biased. So the systematic monetary policy can explain a part of their shocks. And if you, let's say, clean the Aruba and XL monetary policy shocks from variation in systematic monetary policy, then you will have responses. So in red is the responses from the new shock, or the new shock, that you see that you have, let's say, less persistent and stronger responses. So just to say that a lot of these methods are based on, let's say, methods or shocks that have their problems. So one should keep that in account when we're trying then to match models to this. This is the targeted evidence, and the targeted evidence has, of course, some uncertainty around it. And then just my final slide. To say again, this is fantastic work. It's great to learn about policy counterfactuals, and especially as a central banker for monetary policy counterfactual. 2 or 3 little things that, for us, the source of shocks matter. So I think for a central banker, it's important to say if it is a supply oil price shock or a government fiscal shock to assess the counterfactual. How would we have behaved if this was the shock? So I understand that this average or this main business, so it's a cool idea, but I think as a central banker, we need to be more specific on the source of the shock. Then I think it will be also important to keep in mind if this method can take into account that policy rules are time varying, so not to consider one rule for 60 years of data or 50 years of data. And finally, the last part hinges a lot on this persistency of interest rate and the forward guidance type of shock. And this is just to say that the forward guidance, given the experience with the recent inflation, forward guidance are not so favored in the central banking world. So they are still a curiosity in theory, but the idea is these days that we prefer to do, let's say, policy by just looking at meeting by meeting policy. So just to keep in mind that I think it's, for the moment is a good theoretical curiosity, but it doesn't seem to have, at least for some time, some support in practice as a policy. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Claudiana, for your amazing comments. So Thomas, I will send her slides to you after the talk. So do you have anything to add, or should we jump to the second discussion, Thomas?
If you want, we can do the other one, and they talk briefly about.
Okay, all right, sounds good. So then our next discussant is Dr. Sung-Ki Hong. So you may start sharing your screen.
All right. Thanks very much for inviting me to discuss this very interesting paper by Caravello, McKay, and Wolf. Tomás, it was a great talk. Thank you very much. I only have 5 minutes, so let me just jump into the discussion here. So let me first briefly summarize the paper, although Tomás already gave a wonderful presentation. So basically, this paper belongs to this literature of doing the counterfactual policy evaluation without resorting to a full structure model. And in this literature, the key paper is really the McKay and Wolf 2023. McKay and Wolf basically suggest this semi-structural method where we can basically study how macroeconomic variables respond to structural shock differently under counterfactual policy, as long as the counterfactual policy can be well approximated with existing policy shock path. Now, what this paper does is this paper significantly extends this method in 2 very important dimensions. The first dimension is under this invertibility assumption, the counterfactual questions do not really have to be specific to a particular structural shock. Now it can be much more general. things like how the beginning cycle moments are going to be changed or how the historical episodes are going to evolve differently under counterfactual policy. So that's very important extension that this paper makes. And the key intuition is, again, under this invertibility assumption, you really do not need to identify true shocks. But basically, you can apply this mechanical method to word residuals. So that's an important first extension. And the second important extension is that for a counterfactual policy that cannot be obtained by spanning the existing policy shock paths, you can extrapolate it using models, but not using the model in a full way, but in a minimal way. That's the VAR plus part. So this is the second extension that this paper makes. And my view is this is a very important contribution to this particular literature because both extensions are significant and at the same time very important. Now, I'm going to give my comment on something that is something that's conceptual and possibly minor, but is something that I think is going to be interesting and useful if the authors can also address it in the paper. So the counterfactual under this invertibility assumption again, counterfactuals are basically pinned down by reduced form projections A and B policy causal effects, right? And what the author suggests is that for these reduced form projections, we get it from just running a VAR from the data. And then for this policy causal effect, it's best if we can get it from the existing policy shock paths. But if we cannot, then that's the time when we begin to use models, right? That's a VAR plus part. And in that step, that plus part, it is inevitable to have some kind of adequacy test of a model, or precisely the combination of model and parameters. The adequacy test is in a different term, they basically use this posterior density, right? But we want to see which model is more suitable for this extrapolation exercise. And the criterion that the authors choose to do this adequacy test is basically how well this model can replicate or approximate the impulse responses in response to existing policy shock paths, right? And this choice of the criterion is understandable given that models are not really used or doesn't have to be used in constructing these reduced form projections at all. It only involves in extrapolating the policy causal effects, part B. So this choice is understandable, but that doesn't mean that the model can completely screw up in part A. So think about this hypothetical case. What if there's a combination of model and parameter that can very successfully replicate the policy causal effect in response to existing policy shocks by, say, assigning some very weird parameter values? And this model has no way of producing this reduced form projection part anyway close to the data. Should we still evaluate this model as an adequate model for this purpose? And going one step further conceptually, I think to see whether a model can produce these reduced form projections anyway close to data or not, I think in the end, we need to model shocks again in the model. Then we are going back to a full model. So that's my intuition, probably wrong. So I think I'm wondering if there is a way of maintaining the minimal use of the model while still addressing this concern. If there is any smart way of addressing this concern while maintaining this minimal use of the model, or if not, then probably this is a limitation. Then I still want to see the author discussion on how significant or insignificant this limitation is. So that's my main comment. Other than that, I think this is, again, a great paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your wonderful comments. So, Thomas, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, just to comment briefly on both. First, on Claudiana's part, I completely agree with your first comment. I mean, one thing that Chris said is like, I don't know if he likes the VAR plus name that much because VAR in the end is just an estimation method. And the identification result is about the population object that you want to estimate, and VAR is just a simple way that people know to estimate it, but definitely not the only one. So it's something, I agree with you that we should know a little bit better how sensitive results are to different estimation methods there. So yeah, that I agree fully. The other comment on how do we identify policy shocks, I know your paper, and it's a very good paper. I think that will matter as long as as you show the type of impulse response is different, of course, and then you show it is somewhat different. Having a more faster, less persistent response, I think it will actually. I wouldn't say help, but it's true that these type of models have a ton of parts that we put in the models to match a super persistent response at a transitory shock. So having something that is less persistent may help fixing a little bit of that. May lower the reliance on all those quick fixes that we use to get persistence. So yeah, that's something very interesting also to explore how the extrapolation changes, we change the target. Okay, so that I more or less agree with the two comments. A little comment on the last thing, or maybe we can talk about this more because I am interested. You said that central banks want to know the source of the shocks to conduct policy. In our case, we don't need to know that because the only thing you need is basically the forecast, how the forecast changes. And the only reason why you may think that in our case you will care about the shock is because if inflation is going up because it's an oil shock, the forecast will be different compared to the case in which inflation is going up because it's a demand shock. So our method is saying, if that's the only reason why you care where the shock comes from, then you don't actually need to know where the shocks come from. You only need to know the forecast. Now, there might be other reasons why you mentioned that, because it might be the case that if it's fiscal shock, maybe you don't want to counteract it, but if it's an oil shock, you may for some other reason or vice versa. So maybe afterwards we can talk a little bit more about that because I'm interested about that. And then on the forward guidance part, so there are two things. Using it as an explicit instrument of, okay, start manipulating all financial markets by intervening in each market. That's probably, as you said, something that we like. Here we use forward guidance as a language, as just saying how interest rates are expected to change. Now, they may change because the central bank is actively doing forward guidance, or because the central bank says, from now on, I'm going to react to inflation more, and then the public infers that means that rates are going to raise more in response to some shocks. So it's true that we use the language of forward guidance somewhat loosely here. Okay. Going to something also a great discussion. I agree with your overall point that we want to have more evidence to discriminate models, because for some counterfactuals, it seems that it's very important which model you have. It's true that what we do is like it's like a test that is not super powerful to discriminate models, right? Because we just take the minimal set of evidence that we expect the models to match, which is the baseline. The other thing that happens, and I think it's kind of related to your question, is if you take say the parameter estimates that match the ARFs and compare that to the parameter estimates that say Smiths and Barber's fine, okay, those two parameter estimates are not very close. So that's a signal that maybe a model that matches the monetary part well is not a great model for the rest of the economy. Okay, but it's also, I don't know how much of that is still true, because you know that these DHEs may have different points that are like very difficult to identify separately. So you may have the Smith-Summer model having a ton of posterior mass in some parameters, but also some other parameters will also have like high posterior mass. So I'm not super.
Yeah, so that part, I guess what we don't know is when there's a model that can capture very well of this impulse response in response to this existing shock path, but have very different parameter values than what the original model used to have.
Yeah.
Doing the extrapolation of different policy based on that model with new parameter values, how reliable that is, that's a question, right?
It's going to be different, but then the question is who is right? Because you have two models.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. The thing is, if you, in our case, what we say is, well, we argue that ours is right, but why? If you look at if you want like a smell test, if you look at the impulse responses of Smets and Barters for output inflation with response to monetary policy shock, it's just super fast. It looks almost like something like this. It doesn't have a hump. Whereas in the data, you typically find a hump. Now, maybe Claudia is saying, maybe you shouldn't find a hump because the shock is incorrectly identified. That could be true as well. We don't know. But at least in most of the monetary shocks literature, you do find quite persistent humps that Smets and Barters model do not have. Because that model, what they do is they have a core of equations that have some internal persistence, but also they are like AR1 shocks to that. So they have a source of internal persistence.
Yeah.
And in their model,
I agree with you that we don't know who is right? So that part I agree. But then at least the minimal thing that your set of parameters and the model has to satisfy is at least that is consistent with the reduced form projection that you are using from the data, right?
Yeah.
Because that's in your model and in your semi-structured models, right?
So I will need to, I understand the point. It's like, okay, maybe the parameters you get from the IRF matching are completely consistent with taking that same model, putting other shocks, and having that model feed the full data.
Right. If that's satisfied, then you have the internal consistency there, right?
But then the question becomes, do I think it's a good model for matching the rest of the data? The answer might be no, but if I get the monetary part right, the sufficient statistic result tells me that's all I need to get right. That is not to say that we don't think there are other sources of data that we can use to disentangle the models, right? We could also use, micro data, for example. If you have maybe the behavioral parameter we use is crazy compared to what people in the micro data find, for example. That's another source.
Right.
I completely agree that we use kind of very little information. And that's why we are not able to disentangle the models. Now, if you want to use the full likelihood approach, I start concerning about if the model is misspecified in other dimensions. I'm going to reject it, but maybe for the dimension I care about, it's not misspecified and it's correct. So that's a little bit harder. But I do agree with the overall message of you want to have more data to separate these models, but it seems it matters. Okay, so that's what I have to say. Thank you both for the great comments. Yeah, it was very useful.
Thank you, everyone. So, due to the limited time, last call. Any other questions from our audience?
I have a quick question, but actually I want to express my gratitude to both Caravello and to Discussants, especially the Discussants discussion are amazing, mostly answer many of the question I have in my mind. I have one additional question is, okay, so you do this counterfactually say, okay, I replace the policy rule and then I can see, okay, what would be the counterfactual impulse response, what would be the historical decomposition and the conditional forecast. But then a question is, can I construct the counterfactual based on the, not replacing the rule, but do a counterfactual conditional forecast? For example, suppose the Fed announced in the next 12 months, we will keep the interest rate at a certain level. And then would that be possible to be done with your method as well?
Yeah, so you will need to take a stance of what the Fed does afterwards.
Right.
But you can do the forward guidance type exercise of saying, I'm going to keep the rate fixed at some level and then see what happens. The problem there is that the models we use are taken basically off the shelf from the ESG literature, and we know that those models have problems doing that, right? Because of many reasons, the way they lack center and they're very forward-looking. If you try to do a forward guidance counterfactual, those models are going to give you, in general, crazy answers. But we think that's a problem of the models, not a problem of the. So maybe those models. There's more like a detail of these models. Like for some paths that are not very smooth, they behave weirdly. But yeah, but in principle, you could do it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask one more question?
Yes, please.
So thank you, Thomas. This is a very interesting work. I really enjoyed your talk. So in the related econometric paper, it seems important for us to identify the effects of policy news shock in order to approximate the counterfactual rule. So how is it important in this new approach, in this VR plus approach? Do we still need to identify the policy news shock? Thank you.
Okay. In principle, if you did that, it would be great because you could have more targets that will help you to discriminate the models. In this case, we don't do that because we found that the evidence on this type of more forward guidance shocks is less I would say less clear. So there are some people that find some responses, some people that find a little bit different responses, whereas for a transitory hiking interest rate, it's more or less clear what to expect, okay, with the caveats that Claudiana explained before. So in principle, you could add more new shots that will help you tighten the identification of the models and maybe discriminate between models as well. So you could do that. In our sense, that's not like strictly necessary, but if you're not gonna do that, then you are relying more on the plus part. Now we do show that for some counterfactuals, you don't rely on the plus part at all, even with one shot. So that could help for some counterfactuals, but may not be important for others.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for your question and the answer. All right, so due to the time, and we probably need to close our today's talk here. So thank you again to both our speaker and our discussants for giving us a great talk and a great discussions. I believe all our audience have enjoyed a great academic feast today. So lastly, just for your information, our next seminar will be next Friday. We invited Dr. Maurice Linnell from Princeton University to give us a talk. So we are looking forward to seeing you very soon. All right. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.